The Queen's Jewish Link presents the Jewish Living Podcast, the show that examines the many facets of Orthodox Jewish life. Here's your host, Izzo Zwirin.
Unfortunately, we are back again to discuss one of the biggest issues affecting the day-to-day lives of Jews in America: personal and community safety. Jews do not have the best history when it comes to being the victim, and unfortunately, we don't have to look that far back to understand that the threat is still present. From Poway to Pittsburgh, from Muncie to Jersey City, and most recently in Colleyville, Texas, and many, many others that continue to happen, we all know that the danger is ever present. And once again, we thought it would be productive use of our time to see how we can proactively improve our situation. That's why we invited on this week's guest.
My name is Neil Cohen, and I'm a former federal agent. I was a criminal investigator with the U.S. Treasury Department.
Neil and I will discuss how and why the most recent attack in Colleyville is different from and evoked a vastly different response than did previous attacks, as well as what we can do individually as part of a shul and as a community to fight back against the violence. All right, Neil Cohen, thank you so much for joining me this week. I appreciate you taking the time out. Before we get into more of the Inyone Dioma, as it were, can you give me a little bit of a background about yourself?
Sure. So I began my career in federal law enforcement more than 30 years ago. I worked for the U.S. Treasury Department, as I've mentioned, as a criminal investigator. And at the start of my career, I had trained in the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Brunswick, Georgia. It's known as FLETC. And I trained there for about 5 months. And during the course of my career, I worked on investigations typically involving illegal activity. It could have been organized crime, large-scale narcotics trafficking, healthcare fraud, mortgage fraud, identity theft, just a whole variety of investigations involving illicit activity.
And these days, you are retired, or are you still working in the field?
I retired from the government about 7 years ago.
And the reason that we have you on this week is to discuss community and shul safety, especially in the recent light of what happened in Colleyville. But honestly, these conversations could have happened anytime in the last several years. Every time we turn around, there's something that happens in San Diego or in Pittsburgh or in right here locally near to where I live in Muncie or in Jersey City. All of these things, every single time we have these types of events, these types of tragedies, everybody's gets a little bit more insecure about what they're doing in their community. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about, first of all, Colleyville, but not only Colleyville, just the greater situation that we are here in this country, and what we could learn from all of the situations that I mentioned.
So as you mentioned, there is typically a knee-jerk reaction when there is an attack, particularly targeting a Jewish institution. So oftentimes it's in response to an attack that Jewish institutions then step up and try to improve their safety and security. So for example, years back when there was an attack at Chabad on Eastern Parkway, you had someone with a knife, an intruder armed with a knife, and he went into into 770. And so following that attack, one of the shuls that had resisted locking their front doors had chosen to listen to me, to my suggestion that the front doors should be locked. And over time, that's become pretty standard now. Most shuls, I believe, have their doors locked at all times.
So you mentioned that it's a reactionary response when these things happen, and I'll bring that a little bit more out in that that's the case we have not just in the Jewish community, that's everywhere. Anytime there's unfortunately a school shooting or some sort of a mass event, that's when the big conversations come out, and then they go away until the next one. So what I'm thinking at this point, so what I'm thinking at this point is that we shouldn't be only having these conversations in light of tragic events, or I guess the situation in Colleyville didn't end up being tragic, but it definitely could have been. Um, so whenever one of these events happen, we have these conversations. That's why we have you on now. But let's start here. How often should shuls and schools and communities in general reassess their security standards? I would love to be able to do it, every week on a weekly basis. We're going to reassess, but I don't know if that's practical. So in practicality, how frequently should these things be reassessed?
It should really be ongoing. It should be there should be an assessment made on a regular basis, and in particular in light of events locally and around the world. So it should be in part in response to events. So, for example, last May, when Israel was under attack by Hamas, we had the barrage of rocket attacks. So it wasn't it. Today when there's an attack, it's in Israel. It's no longer isolated to Israel, and so what happened after after Israel started to defend itself and started to try to take out the rockets from being attacked from being launched against Israel. So the media started to I believe it was somewhat biased against Israel and accused Israel of being too aggressive in defending itself. And so there were, if you remember, there were incidents in New York in response to what was going on in Israel. So going back to your question, so when there is an incident, when there are hostilities involving Israel, we're no longer isolated from such circumstances. And so Jewish institutions in the US and around the world need to then take note of what's going on in Israel and to take steps to increase its security. So security could be increased, ramped up during certain times of the year or in response to certain events.
I'm interested in your experience about copycat terrorist attacks. So, especially when it comes to situations like in Israel, you might see one particular incident happen, and then somebody say, "Oh, that issue in Israel is actually something that I care about also," and that was a very good idea. So, in your experience, have you seen copycat be more prevalent when there's situations that involve Israel, or when involve a certain group of people that are responsible for the initial attack?
So copycats, the risk of a copycat is real. There's always such concerns. I think it's broader than let's say, the Jewish community or Israel. The risk of a copycat could be, for example, after the Columbine attacks in the late 90s. They became like folk heroes. The two students who carried out the attacks, and that resulted in numerous copycat attacks, active shooter attacks at schools. Some of the attackers had praised the Columbine shooters and were inspired by them. So it's not simply limited to, let's say, the Jewish community. Copycats could happen in any form. As far as the Jewish community, yes, I believe that, for example, if you have an attack, let's use the Colleyville incident as an example. So I followed social media following the attack, and the attacker, the terrorist, he was praised. He was praised for what he had done, and he was viewed as a martyr. And so that is that, in my opinion, that could lead to copycat attacks.
So initially, after the Colleyville attacks, the FBI did not classify it as an anti-Semitic attack. We all remember that. It was very shortly after that they said, yes, it was an anti-Semitic attack. But I'm very curious, just from a law enforcement perspective, what is the difference in terms of how it is handled moving forward, or reactions within the law enforcement community, within the intelligence community? What is the difference between how they handle something if it is considered a race attack or an anti-Semitic or any sort of hate crime versus if it's just a random act of terror?
So I'm not sure I can answer that easily, but my gut instinct is that when you marginalize the nature of the attack, you're basically what you're saying is that it was random, that it wasn't motivated by race, religion, that it was basically a criminal act. So it's not going to garner the same type of response by law enforcement. If it's viewed as just a criminal act as opposed to a terrorist act.
Right. So within the greater community and outside of law enforcement, within everybody else, the notion of seeing a synagogue attack and not having it classified as anti-Semitic gives certain connotations to the rest of the world. But I just was curious, from within the law enforcement perspective, if there's any difference between how things are handled and things like that. I know that I was on a call maybe a week after Colleyville with thousands of other Jewish community people, and it featured the FBI director and the Department of Homeland Security secretary and a whole bunch of other really high up law enforcement people, and told me as a constituent about how seriously they're taking this. I don't know if this type of a call happened with the Jewish community following the previous attacks back in 2019, back in 2017, things like that. But this seemed to be, I'm not sure why this particular attack in Colleyville struck a chord in ways that possibly it didn't before. Do you have any insight into that?
Just my view is that this attack was different than other attacks against Jewish institutions, whether domestically or worldwide, or in general, terrorist attacks. And this was because it was played out for the world. What this attacker had done was somewhat different than what other attackers had done previously, and that you had someone who, instead of carrying out an active shooter attack as he entered the synagogue, he chose to hold them hostage and to broadcast to the world, and to basically air his grievances to the world. And just because of the way it played out, I think it resonated, if you will, with the general public, and certainly with the Jewish institution.
So I didn't see the exact feed because they did have a Facebook feed up, and I didn't see what exactly this person said. Are you saying that this guy knew that they were having a Facebook Live event and that everything was being broadcast, or is that just happened to be that the Shul had that?
No, I don't believe that he was aware of that in advance. I believe, though, that his intention was to hold them as hostages, and it just, but that act in itself, it was treated as a hostage situation, a barricade situation, if you will, and then you have, for the cameras now, you had this large police presence surrounding a Jewish institution. I think it was very visible, very tangible for the public to see on TV as it unfolded. And I think it just made much more of an impact,
right,
on Jewish communities, and on general population.
So when I mentioned that in this case, it provoked a response wherein we had this giant Zoom call with directors of various law enforcement agencies. Are you saying that that might have been because of the repercussions of what this guy was trying to accomplish? That not only did it's not like a person just came into a synagogue or into a Hanukkah party or into a supermarket and shot up people because of the hate, but this person tried to use this in his attack, his hostages, in order to achieve something greater than just killing Jews. Rather, it was more along the lines of someone who was trying to achieve something politically, freeing a what he perceived to be an unjust prisoner. Does that play into this at all in terms of the response from law enforcement?
Could be. I think that maybe what also played into it was that the FBI special agent in charge for the Dallas field office, I think he misspoke. I think he realized that he misspoke when he tried to minimize why the Jewish institution, why the synagogue rather was attacked. I think there was an effort then made to take that back and to show that the FBI and the government as a whole were taking this matter very seriously.
So, having said that, hypothetically, if this person would have entered a different institution, a not Jewish institution, and done the exact same thing with the same demands that they were trying to free a prisoner, obviously that wouldn't be anti-Semitic. This person did choose a synagogue to do this in, but hypothetically, in a case where a different institution, a different community was being under attack, how would that have, first of all, impacted the aftermath in terms of law enforcement, and second of all, how would that have affected how we as the Jewish community try to react to that situation?
So I think the response would have been the same. There would have been a large police response, regardless of the type of institution that was attacked. It could have been a church, could have been a mosque, it could have been any type of religious institution.
Even if it's not religious, it could have been a public school.
It could have been a public school. I think the response would have been large scale as it was in Colleyville. So I'm not sure if there's that distinction between whether it was a Jewish institution or any other institution.
Right, but what about us as a Jewish population? How would we?
So I think what I've seen over time is that Jewish institutions, yeshivas, shuls, are mindful of attacks that take place elsewhere, and they no longer view attacks against other institutions as separate from themselves. I think an attack that takes place targeting even a school could be. I think the professionals, that security professionals who provide consultations with the yeshivas and shuls, I think they take note of that, and they try to make it clear that the attack could have easily also been against a Jewish institution. So, for example, and this goes back a while to the Sandy Hook attack that took place a number of years ago. And so after that attack, I know that one of the yeshivas in New York had asked that I give a presentation to the faculty on how to implement a lockdown, and because they recognized that that this person who carried out the attack there, he could have simply targeted instead of a public school, he could have targeted instead a yeshiva as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. So let's move away from the actual incident of Colleyville, and let's talk about, okay, now what? So every time we have one of these incidents, unfortunately, there's takeaways that can be had from them. So especially if it's a new situation. So we mentioned how different this was from previous attacks. So what from Colleyville can we learn to better reinforce our communities, our shuls, our schools?
I think it's fair to say that it was a rather obscure institution. It's not a well-attended synagogue. In fact, services on Shabbos are held remotely on Zoom, and so it's in light of that, it was still selected as a target. And the reason for that is because it has online visibility. And so we have to recognize today that any synagogue that has a website that promotes its events, that identifies that it supports Israel, that publishes its times of services online. It just because it could be a small institution, it could be on not on a main street, but on a side street, not very visible. Once you're online, once you're visible online, you're now a potential target. So this individual himself, from what we understand now, he only came into the United States only a couple of weeks before he carried out that attack. So it's fair to assume that he had done some research in advance online. Now, what I also feel, and this wasn't made public, but my gut instinct is that he selected the congregation Beth Israel because in the name of the synagogue is the name Israel. And so I think it attracted the attackers' interest because of that. It has greater symbolic value, if you will, that it has in its name Israel.
I would say, is that exclusive to the word Israel? Would Zion count? Would
I think
Jerusalem?
Zion is part of it. Jerusalem, I think more so, I think Israel, and I think Jewish. So you have Jewish centers, you have Young Israels. I think that any religious institution that has as part of its name Israel or has Jewish, many institutions have one or the other, that I think they're at greater risk of being selected as a target because of that increased symbolic value.
Now, in terms of what that's what we could take out of it. What about practical steps that means for shuls and schools? Basically, you mentioned about how now we understand how online visibility matters. Does that mean that we should take down our website, stop mentioning our zmanim on our website? What does that mean practically for us?
So I'll address your question, then I'll give a separate thought. So yes, I do believe that we provide too much information online. It's convenient to have all this information. Listen, I was recently traveling. I went online to look for a shul in the immediate area and to look at the times of services. I found all of that online. So it's very convenient and I appreciated it. But at the same time, it makes it very easy for someone who's interested in carrying out an attack. So you have now what's online is the times of services, and you can specify or rather prepare to carry out an attack at a time when you know that the building will be occupied. So what I do recommend is that the times of services be password protected. So this one of the synagogues that I consult with, that they limit the amount of information that they post online, that they put in their website, and that includes their times of services. It's password protected. It's no longer made available to the general public.
Now there is a technological aspect to what I'm going to ask about. Would it be possible to maybe open the zmanim, the times of service, and maybe times of events and dates of events to anybody that is a member of a greater institution? So if there's a technological way to do that, where I could use my synagogue login to reveal the login, the information from a different synagogue halfway across the country, is that something that we should look into, or is that cost prohibitive?
Yeah, I'm sure the technology exists for information sharing like that. So that would be that I feel would be acceptable. But just simply to put such information as times of services, when events are taking place, when children's programs taking place at a shul, it's convenient. Shul also wants to promote itself, wants to make it clear that it's providing these programs. It's goodwill, but at the same time, it's just in the times that we're living in, I think it's too much information, and I think it needs to be limited to some extent. And the place to start, I think, would be at least with the times of services.
All right. So in Colleyville, we know that at this point, we know that one of the key aspects from how they were able to get out was based on some of the training that the Shul went through at the active shooter drills and things like that. In terms of shuls and schools, I'll add schools in here too. What measures should, if they haven't been implemented, I guess like an active shooter drill, the same way you might have a fire drill, an active shooter drill. What other measures, I'm sure by now people know about active shooter drills. What other measures might shuls and schools think about starting to implement that they might not have until now?
Okay, so one of the things that stands out to me about the attack in Colleyville, and we could use numerous attacks as well, but let's say with Colleyville in particular. So what I read recently about the attack is that one of the hostages had used his phone to discreetly call the police. He dialed 911 and notified the police of what was occurring at the synagogue. And he put himself at great risk for doing so. And to bring another example of where another person had done that, and she had gotten shot for doing that. So years back, there was an attack in Seattle at the Seattle Jewish Federation Center. And so the attacker there had begun opening fire on employees at the office, and one of the office employees had taken out a phone and had attempted to call the police, and she was shot. So what I recommend beforehand, not just because of this incident, but I think this incident illustrates why there's a need, and that's for panic buttons to be strategically placed around a building, and so that it could be pressed. It's a duress alarm system, if you will, and it could be activated but just by pressing the button. It doesn't make a sound, and the dispatcher knows that gets word that there is a threat. It's a panic button is used under very limited circumstances when there's an imminent or actual threat, and would then relay that to the police. So there wouldn't be a need for someone to take out a phone. It would be where oftentimes, and the synagogues that I've worked with, the panic buttons are placed under the bima near Stender. It could be near the entrance of the building. And so these strategic places, the rabbi's office, these strategic places would allow for someone then to press a panic button rather than taking the risk of calling 911 using a phone. So that's something that I think this attack demonstrates.
One thing that somebody pointed out to me, because I told him I was having this interview and I said, do you have anything you want to point out? He said, one thing that I've noticed is that shuls that are larger and that might have different areas for where people daven on a regular basis, people are generally accustomed to davening in one, maybe two of those places. But if they happen to find themselves in a place that they don't usually daven in, and they don't know the procedures for that particular area of the shul when an attack may happen, because they happen to be there, they might not be aware of what to do in that situation. The different rooms might have different protocols. If they're in the bathroom, what do you do if that happens then? I just thought I would bring that up right now, that shuls, should they highlight those things more often and maybe put out some sort of literature for their constituents to know about?
And that certainly would be helpful, that all the congregants of a shul are familiar with the lockdown procedures for each of the rooms. But practically speaking, I think it's much more effective if you have key people within each room who typically lead the services for that minyan, to be aware of how to implement a lockdown. So what I would suggest is that, in particular, at a minimum, the Gabayim should know how to implement a lockdown. They have the attention of the congregants. and they're typically looked at for leadership. So I think it would be very beneficial for, at a minimum, the Gabayim, but it would go beyond the Gabayim, officers of the synagogue as well. But clearly, Gabayim in particular, because of the position that they have, they're at all services. There's always a Gabbai at a particular minyan.
All right. And I want to move on a little bit differently. And we're talking about community safety in shuls and schools. I want to talk a little bit about personal safety for a minute. Are there any things, tips that you see people doing in their personal lives, in their homes, that they may want to change? They may want to alter some of their habits or their or actions regarding their personal safety.
I think it would be very helpful for people to increase their situational awareness. So situational awareness basically means just being aware, being attentive to your surroundings, being aware of your surroundings. And I think that's something that should be improved upon. We live in a time when people are very oblivious of their surroundings. Typically, that's because people have headphones on. They could be distracted with cell phones. They could be looking at their cell phones. I'll give you an example. I kid you not. I remember watching someone walking to shul. He's on his phone, and he literally walks into the glass door, the exterior glass door. That's how oblivious some people are. I take note of how people are walking in and out of shul. They immediately take out their phone to start whatever texting, and it's really it's unwise. So to answer your question, I think situational awareness is key. Whether it's someone who is going in or out of shul, or someone who is going to an ATM machine. So, for example, we don't want to live always as let's say hyper focus. We don't want to always be hyper focused. It takes a lot of energy, and we're not, and it's not realistic to always be hyper focused. But there are times when we need to be hyper focused. There are times when we have to be focused, and then there are times when we could be relaxed. So hyper focus, an example would be, let's say someone's going to an ATM machine. He's taking out some cash. I think that's a time when we're going to be situationally aware, but at a higher level. We want to be hyper focused in such a moment. If we're, let's say a woman is coming out of a supermarket, and she is going to her car, and it's at night, and it's not a very well lit parking lot, I would suggest that's a moment to be hyper focused.
I would say that about a man also.
Yeah, but yes, and I certainly agree with you. But I want to really emphasize the point. That's why I chose a woman who's maybe
perceived as more vulnerable,
more of an easy target. So there are times when we need to be hyper focused. And I believe now that coming in and out of a shul, that's a hyper focused moment. When kids are being dropped off at school, being picked up at school, that's a hyper focused moment. It doesn't have to be. We don't need to be living like this throughout the day. It's not practical. But we have to understand that there are moments when we have to increase our situational awareness. People in law enforcement are much more attuned to being situationally aware. They need to be. They're much more aware of their surroundings, because they could also be a target themselves. So that has to now translate into just a regular person, civilian, if you will. We have to also become much more situationally aware, and clearly we're failing in that area because of, in particular, because of the cell phone.
I'm going to ask you a controversial question now. Do guns belong in Shul?
So I'll say yes, but conditionally, and there are a number of very clear conditions. So I say yes, but I'm qualifying that. And so let me explain to you why. First of all, I say yes to that question. Uh, so we see from the numerous active shooter attacks that have taken place over the years, whether it's at a Jewish institution or at a school, public school, or supermarket or movie theater, what have you. Active shooter attacks are typically over within just several minutes. I've seen statistics using the time frame of between 3 to 5 minutes that an active shooter attack takes place, and so it's not realistic to expect the police to be able to respond in time to prevent an active shooter attack from happening once it's underway. It's just time doesn't really allow for that. And I'll bring a few examples to illustrate that point. So years back, you may remember there was an attack at the Virginia Tech University. And so the shooter, at that time, it was the death toll was the highest ever at that time, I believe. It's been surpassed a number of times since then. But that active shooter attack was actually two separate attacks carried out that morning. So the shooter, he was a student at the school. He first killed two people at a dorm that early that morning, and so that morning before the main attack at Norris Hall, the building where 30 other people were shot and killed. So at the dorm, that there was already a police response to that attack. They were investigating a double homicide that morning. So there was already a fairly large police presence on campus investigating that double homicide, and yet the attacker managed to kill 30 more people about 2 hours later when he began opening fire at the other building. And so what he did is he locked the doors, the exterior doors, with chains, and made it very difficult for the police to respond. So that added to why it made it very difficult for the police to be able to end the active shooter threat earlier than they were able to do so. So that's just one example. The Har Nof attack at the Shul in Israel. That attack. I'm sorry?
That was with a knife. That was not a shooter.
That was with a knife. There were two attackers in that incident, and one was armed with a knife or a hatchet, I believe, and another was armed with a handgun. And so those two attackers managed to kill, I believe, five congregants. And so what happened in that attack was there were two police officers who were directing traffic very close by to the shul. They heard the gunfire, and they responded very quickly. One of the officers was killed by one of the attackers. But it just again demonstrates that the quick police response, and still there were about five congregants who were murdered in that attack. There are other examples of such instances when the police were quick to respond. I could think of the San Bernardino attack in California at a holiday party. The police, from what I understand, they were also nearby. They were actually there was a SWAT, from what I understand, was they were conducting drills close by, and they were able to respond quickly. And yet the two active shooters had killed, I believe, about a dozen people at that holiday party. So again, another instance where just even with a quick police response, there will be possibly numerous casualties. So that's the reason why I feel that shuls and yeshivas, there should be an armed presence. Now, so what I like to make also clear is not just anyone carrying a firearm. I believe someone who is professionally trained law enforcement, so someone who is either off duty or retired from law enforcement, who has the training to engage a threat. And the level of training is significant, because the training that law enforcement has is it involves learning how to shoot when you're moving, learning to shoot a moving target, learning to have judgment shooting, weapon retention, learning how to take cover, learning how to clear a room, learning how to react when the uniform when uniform police arrive. The average person doesn't have that kind of training, and so again, what I say is I believe there should be an armed presence at yeshivas and at shuls, but it should be someone who is professionally trained. Now, people can become very proficient. There are organizations out there that train civilians, if you will, to become very, very proficient in shooting and to responding to a threat. So if someone is prepared to undergo that kind of training, then I believe it would be a good thing to do. Outside of that, if you're talking about just a person who has the experience is simply shooting at a paper target that doesn't move, and that the person who's at the range is not moving, and then doesn't have any real judgment shooting training as well, that's not beneficial. In fact, I believe that's a liability. I personally wouldn't feel comfortable with someone armed in shul who doesn't have a high level of training.
All right, Neil, we are running a little short right now on time. I want to let us know if there's anything else that you think is important for us to know that we haven't covered yet, because I know we could probably talk about this stuff for another, several days. We're cutting into like a 45-minute interview.
Yeah.
But if you have any other thing that you want to let us know before we let you go.
The main thing is the human element. I believe that it's, we could have all these targeted hardening measures in place. We could have cameras, we could have reinforced doors, bollards, perimeter fencing, lighting, what have you. But to me, the most important defense is really the human element. So, and that includes having sound policies and procedures in place, and people to know that to carry through on those policies and procedures, and not to violate them. So, for example, it's a very simple example, but I've seen this where you could have. I saw this at a yeshiva where they had all these targeted hardening measures in place, and when I did a site survey, security survey of the location, the side door was propped open, so you could literally circumvent everything that was in place at the front of the building, and then just enter the building from the side. So the human element is, to me, is the most important line of defense, and that includes situational awareness. That is really the most important line of defense.
Neil, I don't know if you're a social media guy. If you are a social media person, where can people find you and reach out to you if they have questions? If you're not a social media person, where do you recommend that people look into for more resources on some of the topics that we discussed today?
So there's a wealth of information out there for people to learn what steps to take to improve their safety and security. The FEMA puts out a tremendous amount of information. The FBI puts out a tremendous amount of information. The ADL. I'm thinking of there are other Jewish organizations as well. A lot of information, but it takes time and it takes a commitment to understand this information. And it's not just literally downloading a file and then not really understanding the content that's available out there. But it's doable. Lay people can become very, very savvy when it comes to security. CSS members, typically they're lay people, but have taken an interest to understand how to recognize a threat, how to respond to a threat, and they're very good at what they do. And so it requires time and commitment.
All right, so I'm going to ask this. If there's somebody out there listening that says, this Neil Cohen guy sounds really knows really what he's talking about. I want to get in touch with him and see if he can consult in my synagogue as well. Is there a way for people to reach out to you? If that's simple as let them get in contact with me and I'll get in contact with you for them, that could be it. But is there a way that people can get in touch with you?
If they could reach out to you, and I would appreciate that. I have online content, but I think I would prefer if they just reach out to you.
Okay, so if you're out there listening and you are interested in getting in touch with Neil, he does keep a low profile, but you can get in touch with me and I will reach out to him for you and put you in touch should the situation call for it. Neil, thank you so much for your time and insight into what is always going to be a difficult situation, unfortunately.
And I appreciate the opportunity to be with you and be on your podcast. Thank you very much, Isa.
My thanks to Neil Cohen for educating us on safety measures this week. While this was clearly a lot, there was even more that Neil wasn't able to answer and even more that we had to cut out. If you would like to hear another episode on Shul safety, check out episode 67, Shul Security with the CSS's Richard Preem. Until next time, Kol Tov.
The Jewish Living Podcast is produced by Sreli Pikus. Our theme song is The Band by A.B. Rottenberg. Follow us on Facebook at The Jewish Living Podcast and on Twitter and Instagram at Jewish_living. You can also email the show at jewishlivingpodcast@gmail.com. The Jewish Living Podcast is recorded in conjunction with the Queens Jewish Link.